Hi, welcome to American Government Standards. My name is Matthew Chapman and I'm your teacher. This is the first of many videos to help describe why the government is important to you. Alright, this will be the first video for the Social Studies Standards for Government. This standard states the student will demonstrate knowledge of the political philosophies that shape the development of the United States constitutional government. So here we go. Alright, the first substandard is substandard A for this standard, and it says analyze key ideas of limited government and the rule of law as seen in the Magna Carta, the Petition of Rights, and the English Bill of Rights. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to talk about with the whole idea of limiting control, this whole philosophy idea of how our government's established, is this document right here. This is the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is really important. The name is Latin for the big charter. And basically it was a charter. It was an agreement between the King of England, King John I, and the nobles, that King John could not have any kind of act that did not coincide with the Magna Carta. Basically, on June 15th, 1215, there were a number of nobles that rebelled against King John I. And to stop a war from happening, a giant English Civil War, which eventually did happen, but to stop the Civil War from happening under his reign, King John I made the decision to sign this Magna Carta that would limit his power over England. Before he signed this, the power of the king was ultimate. He could make his wish was the law. But now, because there's the Magna Carta and he has the nobles to back him, he has to act within the confines of this limited government idea. And this is very important to us now because our Constitution basically does the same thing for our federal government. Any three branch of our government, the judicial, the legislative, and the executive, cannot go beyond what the Constitution states. And so the Magna Carta right here was kind of the forerunner of our Constitution. In fact, if you go to Washington, D.C., in the National Archives, before you get to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and all those documents, those original documents, you will see an original copy of the Magna Carta. This kind of helps to demonstrate the importance of the Magna Carta on our government today. Alright, the next document we need to talk about is the English Petition of Rights. As you can see right here, the scene that we have is somewhat brutal, and even though it's a drawing and really it's not that bad, but kind of give you the whole shot of it. But after the signing of the Magna Carta, everything was not perfect as the nobles hoped that it would be. And for many, many years, the balance of power between the nobility and the king was uneven. The king always had more power. Even when the nobles tried to rebel, the king still had more power. And so a few years, for almost 400 years, a little over 400 years, after the Magna Carta was signed in 1628, the King of England at the time was King Charles I. He decided to kind of do away with Parliament and the nobles. That Parliament, or their legislative branch, essentially the people that make laws, didn't need to exist anymore. That King Charles I could make the laws himself and execute them all at the same time. Obviously the nobles and Parliament did not like this idea, and so they drafted the English Petition of Rights, which basically meant that the nobles, and really anyone who was a citizen, meaning that you had certain powers, you own land, and or of the right gender, race, religion, all that kind of stuff. If you were a citizen, then you could, you had personal rights. You had rights to yourself. And this Petition of Rights was signed by Charles I, but he eventually went back on it, which caused this scene right here. But more importantly, it caused the English Civil War, which was a very long and bloody war that eventually ended up in King Charles I's death. But the English Petition of Rights is a really important idea of limiting government, going back on the Magna Carta and saying that we need to figure out what else to do to help limit government. Alright, so as a result of the English Civil War, we had two people come in and take over England. And neither one of these people were actually English themselves, but and there was a lot more involved in the English Civil War itself. But the two people that came and take over were William and Mary of Orange, the picture we have right here. And they were important because they added to the Magna Carta and eventually added to the English Petition of Rights. And in 1689 developed the English Bill of Rights. Now the English Bill of Rights was kind of the end-all be-all when it came to limiting government. That everyone in England had certain rights, not just the nobility, not just the king, not just Parliament, but everyone in England had rights that must be followed by the king. This was very, very similar to our Bill of Rights in the United States. But the English Bill of Rights was kind of what gave us the idea of having a Bill of Rights to begin with. And we'll talk about the Bill of Rights later. But William and Mary of Orange were very, very important in helping to develop these Bill of Rights.
Alright, the next substandard we're going to do is substandard B of standard 1, and it's analyzed the writings of Hobbes and the Leviathan, Locke in the Second Treatise of Government, and Montesquieu in the Spirit of Laws, as they affect the concept of our government.
Alright, the next big influence that we need to talk about for the Constitution is a few different people. The first guy we're going to talk about is Thomas Hobbes. We talked about the Magna Carta and the Petition of Rights and the English Bill of Rights, and those are really important. They all kind of wrap up into one document. And if you remember, the English Bill of Rights and the English Petition of Rights were both kind of the result, or actually the beginning, and then the result of the English Civil War. Well, Thomas Hobbes lived during this English Civil War, and basically how the war was fought were between the monarchists, or the people who wanted the king to stay in power, and a guy named Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell wanted Parliament to be able to make decisions, kind of a representative type of government, even though when he came to power, that's not at all what happened. But Thomas Hobbes lived during this time, and he wrote a book called the Leviathan. And basically, the Leviathan says that people need government. That the idea of anarchy and the idea of people working without a government cannot exist because we're all self-interested. And the things that I want, let's say that there's a area of land that I call mine that I want, and there's an area of land that you call yours that you want. And if we both want that land, eventually there's going to be a fight over that. And it's going to get to a point where we're not only fighting over land, we're fighting over food, we're fighting over clothing, we're fighting over anything that we need to survive. And to kind of calm this and to kind of give us an area where we can live peacefully with one another, Thomas Hobbes said that in the Leviathan that government was created to help us create this this ability for us to exist without fighting all the time. And he also called for a very strong central power, or a very strong king, essentially. Even though he was not technically a monarchist during the Civil War, he did say that we needed a king, we needed a strong central power to help us make decisions and to help execute those decisions. Because without that, then we would never be able to really function as individuals. And so, he basically stated that humans need a strong central government to survive and need a strong central government for society to exist. Alright, so the next guy we're going to talk about is a guy named John Locke. John Locke's ideas are very similar to those of Thomas Hobbes in the idea that we need government. That government is formulated to protect society, because without government, we would all be fighting all the time and never be able to get anything done. And so John Locke's ideas, it was the idea of a social contract theory. And that's very, very important, the social contract theory, which basically stated that society forms government as a contract, and that when a society forms a government, they expect a few things. They expect, first off, protection. They expect protection from other countries or from other societies. They also expect protection from other people in that society. And they also expect protection from the government itself. And this is where it gets really controversial, because John Locke stated in his Second Treatise of Civil Government that governments were formed to help protect the people. And if they're not doing their job, and if they are abusing their power by not doing their job, then it's the citizen's responsibility, my responsibility, your responsibility, to overrule that government, overthrow that government. Obviously, this is very similar to the Declaration of Independence, which will be in a different video. But John Locke's ideas were super popular among the founding fathers and very, very important in forming our country and the revolution against England. Alright, so the last guy we're going to talk about that helped to develop the Constitution, the last thinker, is a guy named Montesquieu. And his whole name is, let's see, Charles Louis de Secontant Baron de Ledred et Montesquieu, which is a really long name, and I had to look at my notes to figure that out. But Montesquieu is a very important thinker when it comes to the creation of our Constitution. In the spirit of the laws, which was his big book, his big writing that we use a lot in our country still through the Constitution, he talks about the idea of separation of powers. This is a really important idea that's we still debate on today, and it's the separation of powers between the three branches. I mean, that's one way that we see it in our government. We have a judicial branch, we have a legislative branch, and we have an executive branch. We also separate powers through federalism, or the separation of powers between the federal government and state governments. Both of these are written in the Constitution, and the Constitution really kind of copied a lot of its ideas from Montesquieu. And separation of powers wasn't really the only idea in the spirit of the laws, even though it was a really important idea. Some of the other ideas were things like a constitutional government, or abolishing slavery, or protecting civil liberties. These are some of the really important ideas that we kind of stole from Montesquieu in the formation of our Constitution. Alright, so to kind of tie all this together, I've drawn this graphic organizer up on my whiteboard, and basically the government of the United States is in the middle, and this would be a great thing to draw on your own as we go through in the next minute or so. So the government of the United States is in the middle. These are the things that really influence the government. If you see, there's arrows pointing from each one of these things to help influence the government that we have now, and the government that you're learning about in this class. The first thing that we talked about was the Magna Carta. And remember, it was the great charter, the thing that really helped to develop limited government in England. The next thing was a Petition of Rights. Caused Charles I's death. The next thing was the English Bill of Rights, and all three of these are from the English government. This is important because the government in the United States is very similar to the English style of government. In fact, most of the people who wrote the Constitution were in fact English. On the bottom, we have the three people that we talked about and their books. The first is Thomas Hobbes with the Leviathan, the idea that we need a government to exist. The next is John Locke and the Second Treatise of Civil Government, which is basically kind of the same idea, except that when the government oversteps its bounds, it's the citizen's responsibility to overthrow that government. And then, last but not least, is Montesquieu and the spirit of the laws, which represented separation of power. So hopefully that kind of wraps the idea up. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to webmail me or call me, and we will get some of these ideas figured out. But thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys later.